Okay, so all of this, when we say, well, how are people seeing the world? How are they rationalizing this to themselves? In other words, how are you explaining to yourself why building a nation on slavery, Indian removal, and exploitation across economic status is still democratic? Well, one of the basic ways that people in the early days of the United States reconciled that contradiction, or at least tried to, was through the ideology of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism provided them with the framework, the explanation for why it was okay to do these things and why it actually made sense, why it was actually natural and just part of the world rather than a political, economic, or social decision. So there's 6 different aspects of this ideology. The first one is faith and reason. The second is natural law. The third is republican virtue. The fourth is progress. The fifth is nationalism, which just means early nationalism. And then the sixth is freedom. So we're just going to kind of walk through those and make sure you feel comfortable with each of these ideas. Please note that we will be coming back to these ideas quite a bit through the course. So if you do not understand any of these ideas or how they tie together, it would be really good to ask more questions about that, to even reach out one-on-one to talk about it. I'm very happy to do it, but I just really want to emphasize that these concepts are very embedded in the course, and so it's important that you feel comfortable in utilizing them for analysis. So this first idea of faith and reason basically comes out of reformations in Europe, and this idea also basically came across to North America with British colonists. Faith and reason is a counter to the strong dominance of the church, especially the Catholic Church, that you should just submit to authority and let someone else tell you what your ethics or your morals should be. This also coincides very much with a monarchy, a resistance to a monarchy, that you should just submit to the king, what the king says is right, that you should not employ your own logic, your own reasoning, your own morals to make these decisions. So faith and reason is saying no. Actually, we all as individual human beings have the capacity for intellectual development, critical thinking, and decision making, and therefore we are all capable of discovering for ourselves what is right or what is most appropriate. We do not need to just defer without any sort of critique to some sort of authority just because it's an authority. So in that sense, faith and reason is very much tied to independence. It's tied to this idea that you can govern yourself, that you can make good choices yourself, that you don't need to wait for somebody else to tell you what to do, and you don't need to submit to someone else telling you what to do. So this centers the individual as someone who's capable of using the intellect. It also connects reason to virtue, that you are a good person because you're using your intellect to make good decisions, that you are free when you are able to use this intellect to make decisions, and that we as a nation will move forward or progress when everyone is thinking critically, using their intellect, and making good choices. So from this standpoint then, we're very clearly separating the body from the mind. We're separating emotion from intellect. There, in this concept, is a belief that it's possible to just have a pure, objective, untouched, neutral intellect that is separated out from experience, from your body, from emotion, from all of that. Okay. So the other part of that then is this idea at this time period that there is such a thing as truth with a capital T, like this absolute fixed permanent truth that's just waiting out there to be revealed, and that it's through asking good questions and making a good search with your intellect that you will reveal this truth. So then the last part, I just mentioned that there's this assumed split between your mind and your body, between your intellect and your emotions. This becomes kind of an organizing principle in general with liberalism, this binary thinking, this either or, yes, no, black, white framework. That becomes really important because there's really not a lot of room for gray area here in terms of, are you good or are you bad? Are you a citizen? Are you not? Are you civilized? Are you savage? These become dichotomies that are very firmly embedded in the ideology And that matters later on, especially when we talk about issues of race, gender, or economic status in relation to public schools. Okay. So the second aspect of classical liberal ideology is natural law. Natural law is related to faith and reason in the sense that the big truths with a capital T that are out there, those are natural laws. And so it's through the application of your intellect that you kind of reveal these natural laws and are able to understand them. But the basic logic with classical liberalism, back in the day liberalism, is this idea that the universe is very organized, it's very orderly, it's consistent. It basically works like a machine would work based on these permanent or fixed truths. So intellect in this standpoint is basically a way of dominating nature. You use your intellect to understand these laws so that you can manipulate or control them. So from this kind of standpoint, you're not necessarily saying, I am a very tiny part of the universe and there are a lot of things bigger than me. What you're saying is that human beings are the center of creation and we have the right and the authority to rule over all other parts. So this is a very strong contradiction to a lot of worldviews of indigenous people, for example, who would say that we came last in the order of creation. The earth came first, trees came first, animals came first. Therefore, we need all of them to survive, but they may not need us. So the European liberal view is completely the opposite, where they're saying, we came last, but all of that is there for our use and enjoyment. So we have the right to exploit it or consume it however we wish. So there's a kind of separation there between humanity and nature, similar to that binary thinking we saw before, between civilized, uncivilized, and so forth. The implications of this for just behavior would be, for example, industrialization. The idea that because you can make money and because we have the idea, the intellectual capacity to figure out how to do this, then it's okay to do it, without real regard for the long-term implications in the environment. The other part that natural law kind of rationalizes in terms of dominance or subjugation is along issues of race and gender. So natural law, this idea that everything has its place, that there's certain truths that are just always like this, that everybody has a cog in the machine, also applies to hierarchies of humanity. So when people say, like, the woman's place is in the home, or African Americans should all be slaves, there's just that kind of taken for granted idea that that's just who you are, and this is just what your place should be in the world. So you're ranking, you're sorting, and you're dividing people, but you're using this rationale where you naturalize it and you make it seem like that's just the way the world works. It's not because we've created laws, it's not because of political disenfranchisement, it's not because of active violence and repression, it's because the universe wants it to be this way. So the third aspect of classical liberal ideology is Republican virtue. And Republican virtue is basically, there's two parts. First, Republican, the idea that this is a collective virtue, that it's tied to the survival of the nation. The second one is just that there are certain behaviors, attitudes, and ways of being that are very desirable to maintain and support that nation. So Republican virtue is good behavior on the part of citizens that will individually make them successful, but that will also, when everybody does it, make a strong country. So the biggest part of Republican virtue is this idea of the Protestant work ethic, this idea that you defer gratification, you live a very sober, frugal, restrained life, that you work hard, and you're very disciplined. So in this sense, basically, another way to put it would be that you completely deny the body, deny emotion, and you really emphasize the intellect, so that you are basically trying to separate yourself from these so-called, like, baser instincts. And this is, remember, in a context where Protestantism is very much a cultural norm. Okay. So the other part that we have to understand when you talk about this as an either-or idea, that either you're virtuous or you're not, either you're intellectual or you're emotional, is that it also defines virtue itself as being either all present or all absent, an either-or idea, rather than a more complex or balanced situation. And again, we'd already talked about yeoman farmers, but yeoman farmers are probably the strongest example of what Republican virtue would look like. One of the most important parts of that is that people in this time period are saying not only that it's really good for everybody to act in a Protestant work ethic kind of way, but if your individual interests conflict with the well-being of the nation, you should focus on the well-being of the nation. That becomes very important because in our current time period, the attitude quite often is the exact opposite, that it's really about the individual. It's not necessarily about your relationship to the broader collective. So the fourth aspect then is progress. And progress in this ideology is envisioned as a steady upward forward climb, where everything in the past is considered a little bit worse, everything in the present is a little bit better, and the future is just always looking up. So it's considered just kind of guaranteed through classical liberalism that you will continue to improve, that you will continue to get better. We're in a time period where a lot of innovation with science and technology is very new, and so people are having a lot of confidence that whatever science develops is going to be better. And so in that sense, intellect and faith and reason are crucial to progress. The more you can innovate, the more you can apply your reason, the more you can look for new things, the more you move forward into the future. The other implication for this then is if you framed people as less intellectually capable, if you frame them as somehow lower in this human hierarchy through natural law, you've basically identified people who may be considered a threat to progress, or people who may impede progress because they're not as fit to use their intellect well as a way to dominate, or as a way to advance that progress. So the fifth portion of classical liberalism is nationalism, early nationalism. At this time period, the idea of being the United States was not necessarily a done deal. A lot of people were still very uneasy about this. There are still a lot of differences between the states. There were a lot of cross purposes between the states where they weren't always working in unison, or may in fact be competing against one another. There really was no strong central government, and there was a lot of debt because of the revolution. So for all of those reasons, as well as social and cultural reasons, there was a lot of tension around whether or not the U.S. was actually going to make it. Is this going to work? Are we going to hold together? So as we see in a little bit, people like Benjamin Rush and Noah Webster were very much interested in using schools as a strong socializing mechanism to teach people how to be American, to teach them nationalism, to teach them patriotism, to teach them an allegiance to the new nation that they may not have felt before. Prior to this, they may have felt like I'm a Virginian or I'm a New Yorker. They may not feel like I'm an American. And so schools in this context were used to develop that feeling and that investment and that loyalty. Okay, so then the last one is freedom. Now, freedom in this context is talking about negative freedom. And what that means is freedom from interference or intervention, freedom from a strong central government. So in this time period, there's this idea of the local over the federal, and that small government is the most desirable form of government. So freedom is very much, as we said earlier, connected to faith and reason. This idea that in a democracy, everyone should have the ability to self-govern. They should have the ability to use their intellect to make good decisions and to contribute to the whole. Jefferson also goes on to argue that it's an informed citizenry that can prevent tyranny. He uses a lot of examples about if people are able to read the newspaper and be well informed about issues, they're going to be able to prevent being oppressed.